Hello, this video is to give you some thoughts about your beliefs as a teacher, educator or mentor and how those accord with your practices. I'm Jo Gakonga and this is another video for teacherfeedback.org. So this all came about because I read this paper which I thought was really interesting, and it really looks at the dichotomy and the tensions between an authoritative kind of approach to feedback and a dialogic approach to feedback. And I think this is a really interesting area to explore, so I wanted to share this with you. So they talk about trainer authoritativeness in a backed-in kind of sense. And so what they talk about as authoritative discourse includes the following kind of things, which all sound rather negative, I have to say. So we've got the dominance of the evaluative voice of the teacher, basically the teacher saying what's right and what's wrong, and consequently also having to negotiate face issues, being polite, for example, and couching things in more positive terms. There's also an idea of an imposition of the teacher's views as true. So I know and I'm right as a teacher or a trainer. And also then limited opportunities for the learners to express their views. Now the way that this could be measured is that the trainer or the mentor will tend to dominate the talk, that their average turn length will be quite long, and that there'll be a high frequency of particular key words. So you can quantitatively measure this. And obviously it all sounds rather negative, but I think it's worth thinking about the fact that actually trainees often want this kind of directness, that there's plenty of research evidence that says that they like being told because it's more straightforward in lots of ways. On the other side of the coin, we have the dialogic discourse, and that tends to promote reflection. The idea is that we're trying to get the trainees to talk, to think about their own practice, that hopefully it nurtures development, and that there's greater co-construction of the discourse. So it's working together towards development. Now, again, all of this sounds very positive, and so it sounds as if we're setting up a dichotomy between what's good, dialogic, and what's bad, more directive, authoritative. But I don't think this is necessarily the case at all, of course. So in the case of the former, the authoritative kind of voice, you've got that you're the giver of knowledge. Now in some cases that's going to be necessary. In some cases trainees are going to want to be told, especially if they don't know, so you're giving them very clear guidelines there, and that can be a good thing, a very good thing. On the other hand, of course, with the dialogic space, you're facilitating their reflection, facilitating them to find out what's going to work for them in their context and in their case. A dialogic space is going to reduce the power imbalance, and that's a positive thing, but making it more direct is often more efficient, and time is often of the essence. There probably isn't as much time as you'd like for feedback, so that can be a positive thing too. So inevitably there is a tension between these two things, and the balance and where you sit on that climb between the two things is going to vary depending on the situation. Now, what this paper was looking at then was the trainer's beliefs and how these accorded with their actual practice of these two extremes. So they looked at Bree et al.'s model for beliefs, pedagogical principles and instantiation. And how this works is that, according to Bree et al., your beliefs lead to your pedagogical practices, which in turn lead to your instantiation. So what those things actually mean is that your beliefs are your underlying personal theories that you hold about teaching and learning and language. And in the case of training, obviously your personal theories about teacher development and about how that works. Your pedagogical principles then are descriptions of your ideal practice, what you think you should be doing. And your instantiation is your repertoire of practices, what you actually are doing. Now, of course, it's not as simple as this. So Bree et al. Are talking about this fairly linear kind of progression, but of course it isn't that simple. There are all sorts of ways in which these three things interact with each other. But let's look at it from that point of view for this paper. So we're looking at how the trainer's beliefs accorded with their practices. And what the researchers did was that they looked at 4 different trainers on a short initial teacher training course and interviewed them initially to talk about what their beliefs were, and then recorded their practice to see whether there was congruence between those two things or not. And here are some of the results. So obviously all of these are pseudonyms, but in Mark's case, for example, we got the belief that trainees should reflect, but actually no elicitation of that in practice. So there wasn't congruence there. Although in other areas, so for example that the trainer should evaluate, so they should select the areas for focus, there was congruence there. That's what did happen in practice. In Tom's case, for example, his beliefs were much more congruent with what he actually did. So he felt, when interviewed beforehand, he said that reflection was important and possible, and therefore we should ask trainees questions, and he did. If we look at the 2 other trainers that he asked, Jason and Simon, again pseudonyms obviously, so there was lack of congruence here in Jason. When interviewed before, he suggested that reflection allows the trainees to analyse their practice, and so therefore you should ask them questions, but actually he didn't ask them any question. But he was more congruent where he said that trainees can't see the reasons, so you have to prompt them, and yes, he did prompt them. On the other hand, he was congruent in the fact that he felt that peer feedback didn't help, and actually he didn't allow that in practice. So we've got quite different practices from different trainers as well. Simon, in this final case, felt that negative feedback was destructive, so he should let trainees self-correct, but actually in practice didn't do that. So there wasn't congruence between what he believed and what actually happened. So what the researchers concluded from this were that there were 2 kinds of beliefs. There were experiential beliefs and received beliefs. Now the experiential beliefs were based on what trainers had actually experienced, obviously, and the received beliefs were associated then with progressive methodologies which they may be under social pressure to conform to, i.e. a more dialogic approach largely. And what they felt was, from the analysis of the recordings, that the experiential beliefs, there were high levels of congruence with this. What trainers had found from their own experience and therefore believed, they tended to actually do. Whereas the received beliefs, the things that they felt they perhaps should do, there was more often incongruence with practice here. So I think that we're often walking a bit of a tightrope. We're trying to balance these 2 areas, the authoritativeness and the more dialogic space. And that's often the trick of good feedback. So I leave you with a couple of questions. The first is this one. What do you think? How much do you steer the feedback conversation? Are you directive? Do you have an authoritative nature? And if so, do you feel guilty about being directive, or do you just see that this is part of your job? And therefore, I suppose, what are your beliefs, and do they match what you actually do in practice? I don't think there's any right answers here at all, but I think the questions are interesting and worth considering in order for us to continue to develop ourselves as practitioners. So I leave you with those thoughts. I hope that they're interesting ones, and I really look forward to your comments and what you feel about this. Thanks very much. Bye bye.